When we left off, Andraste and Maferath had begun their campaign on the Tevinter Imperium. It is worth taking a step back to consider the state of the Empire at this time. For 192 years, the Darkspawn Horde, headed by the Archdemon Dumat, had ravaged Tevinter and its provinces, not only killing its people and burning its cities, but scarring its landscape. The passage of the Horde left the land itself corrupted and unable to sustain life. The reckless tunneling of the corrupted beasts beneath the ground destabilized the landscape in some areas and redirected underground rivers, depriving some areas of their ancient water sources and causing unexpected flooding in others. Famine and drought were widespread and frequent occurrences. Social upheaval followed as the people tore down the temples of the dragon gods they had worshipped for centuries, and upon which the legitimacy of the reigning archons was based. Even after the Archdemon was finally killed and the Darkspawn scattered upon the Silent Plains in 203 Ancient, Tevinter struggled to stabilize. In fact, they had been withdrawing soldiers from their frontiers for years in an effort to confront their internal problems. The furthest southern outpost of Ostagar in the Ferelden Valley had actually been abandoned and claimed by the Chastened 4 years before Andraste and Maferath marched. Tevinter had never been weaker, and outer territories inhabited primarily by governed peoples who viewed the Alamari as liberators fell quickly, with the notable exception of Amerius. The center of the imperial slave trade weathered the Alamari, only to fall to an internal revolt over a century later. Fortuitously timed disasters in the form of famines, groundquakes, floods, and wildfires were taken as signs of divine favor by Andraste's followers, who claimed it was the hand of the Maker at work. The Maker, seeing the will of Our Lady, struck down mighty Tevinter with drought, wildfires, and the weakening of the very earth beneath them. On one occasion, a particularly strong quake broke the walls of a Tevinter fortress shortly before the Alamari arrived. These events are sometimes used to support the belief, popular in Tevinter, that Andraste was actually a particularly powerful mage. However, outside the halls of chantry priests and Tevinter magisters, scholars have pointed out that many such disasters the faithful claimed as miracles did not actually aid the campaign at all, and were likely simply the result of the lingering effects of the First Blight. Nonetheless, her following only grew in numbers and zeal. The ranks of Andraste's host swelled the liberated peoples of Tevinter's provinces, inspired by the prophet and eager to strike a blow against Tevinter. Andraste and Maferath's campaign raged across Tevinter's southern territories for 9 years. Lest it sound like natural disasters and the Blight did the Alamari's work for them, the Alamari did face considerable resistance from the Imperial legions, and Maferath proved himself a masterful tactician, but the Archon's attention remained split by worsening internal strife. In cities across the Empire suffering from famine, brutal slave uprisings were taking place. The elven man who led his people in rebellion is known to history as Shartan, although there are scant details about him, and it has been suggested that the name may have been used by many different elves leading revolts around the same time. The Canticle of Shartan describes elven slaves ambushing and slaughtering imperial legions with harvesting blades and stone-headed arrows to steal their weapons and armor. As Andraste and Maferath approached the imperial capital, it is said they met the elves led by Shartan, and Andraste invited them to share the food and shelter of the Alamari. Shartan told Andraste of his people's fight. When the tale was finished, Andraste said to Shartan, "Truly the Maker has called you, just as he called me, to be a light for your people. The host you see before you march, bearing his will north, where we shall deliver it to Minrathous, city of magisters, and we shall tear down the unassailable gates and set all slaves free." And Shartan looked upon the prophet Andraste and said, "The people will set ourselves free. Your host from the south may march alongside us." The giants of the south rose to their feet as one and bowed, and Andraste said, "It is done. We march as one." They would need the support, for in marching into the Tevinter heartland, the Alamari were no longer faced with a sympathetic population eager for liberation, and the magisters finally gave the barbarians their undivided attention. For the first time, Maferath and Andraste truly faced the full might of Tevinter's legions. They clashed at the Battle of Valerian Fields in 171 Ancient. Though Andraste and Maferath ultimately triumphed, it was not the one-sided rout described sometimes by the faithful. The Alamari took great losses, and Andraste herself was separated from her guard by Tevinter mages, and saved only by the timely intervention of Shartan, according to his canticle. She declared him her champion and gave him her sword, Glandivalis, which had been her mother's. Tevinter's armies received a resounding defeat. This left the path to the imperial capital, Minrathous, virtually defenseless. Maferath and Andraste laid siege to the city, but its considerable defenses proved immovable, and they fell back to their stronghold at Navarra. All of Maferath's prior accomplishments have been eclipsed by what happened next. The warlord organized a secret meeting with the Tevinter ruler, Archon Hissarion, and struck a bargain to betray his wife. Andrastian tradition teaches that Maferath grew jealous of the veneration his armies held for Andraste, and that his relationship with her was eclipsed by her spiritual betrothal to the Maker. Less religious historians, however, suspect his thinking was more pragmatic. While Maferath had shared the Alamari's anger at the death of Eldorath, he never shared the zeal of Andraste or her followers. While Andraste saw their march as an arrow aimed for nothing less than the total destruction of Tevinter, Maferath wanted to build an empire to rival it in perpetuity. Maferath knew that they did not have the numbers to properly hold the lands they had already conquered. Indeed, they had not fortified many of their conquests, and some had already been reversed by smaller Tevinter forces after the bulk of the Alamari had moved on. Continuing to push north risked everything they had gained and more. Worse, many of the Alamari chieftains that had marched from Ferelden had died at the Battle of Valerian Fields, and their people had become only more zealously bound to Andraste without the influence of their traditional leaders. There was no way for him to dissuade them, and Andraste was set on her course. So Maferath secretly sued for peace with Archon Hissarion. They reached an agreement. The Archon would relinquish all claims to the lands conquered by the Alamari, and in exchange Maferath would give him Andraste. Maferath lured his wife into a trap and smuggled a group of Tevinter soldiers into Navarra. According to the popular account in the Chant of Light, Habard the Aegis was with Andraste when she was captured. Unable to raise his sword against his lord and lifelong friend, but unwilling to stand by as Andraste was brought to be executed, Havard used his own body as a shield and was struck down by Tevinter soldiers. Andraste was brought to Minrathous, tied to a stake, and burned by the Archon in 170 Ancient. But as she burned, Andraste never cried out. Andrastian tradition holds that when he saw Andraste's stoic pain, Archon Hissarion felt remorse. Or perhaps he looked out over the crowd and saw that rather than rejoicing in the death of their enemy, the people of Minrathous were at once enthralled and horrified by her silent suffering, as the laments of the Alamari outside the walls of the city were heard by all. In any case, Hissarion strode forward and plunged his sword into Andraste's heart, ending her torment with her life. It is said that Havard the Aegis, dying, somehow entered the city after the crowds had dispersed and Andraste's pyre burned to ash. Havard wept and pressed the prophet's ashes to his heart. His ears filled with the song of multitudes, raised in chorus, and before his eyes the dark skies parted, and Andraste, dressed in cloth of starlight and armored in moonlight, stood before him, and he was afraid. The lady knelt at his side, saying, "Arise, Aegis of the faith. You are not forgotten. Neither man nor maker shall forget your bravery so long as I remember." At this his wounds healed, and he stood and gathered up the ashes and carried them to the lands of the Alamari, away from sorrow forever. A secretive Andrastian sect hid Andraste's ashes deep in the Frostback Mountains, and built the Temple of Sacred Ashes to protect them. Maferath took the Alamari south and portioned the conquered lands between his sons, returning to rule over the Ferelden Valley himself. He did not forget the elven slaves that had fought so hard for freedom, and gave them the Dales, a place where they could build a kingdom all their own. They had peace. The Tevinters did not. Andraste's martyrdom had not only grieved the Alamari, but provided inspiration to the non-mage citizens of Tevinter, the Soparati. Andraste's faith swelled in popularity, but despite the opposition of the old god cults and the most ancient of Tevinter's aristocracy, Hessarian refused to quash the new faith. Then, 10 years to the day from Andraste's death in 160 Ancient, Archon Hessarian declared his conversion to the Andrastian faith and made it the state religion of Tevinter, beginning a period that is now known as the Transfiguration. The faith of the old gods was outlawed and its priests were executed. The temples were seized and turned into the first circle of Magi as Hessarian founded the Imperial Chantry. With the overwhelming support of the Soparati on his side, there was nothing the Magisters could do to stop him. Whether his conversion was merely pragmatic or genuine remains a topic of debate. Certainly he had broken the power of his rivals in the Imperium, and with a single stroke shattered the unity of the Alamari, for he publicly revealed Maferath's betrayal of Andraste. Maferath's authority among the Alamari crumbled to nothing overnight, and the empire he had built ultimately collapsed. When the 3 sons of Maferath heard, they were enraged, for though they were not born of Andraste, they had known her as mother and prophet both. In time, Maferath's tribe was crushed, and he was killed by his sons. In the end, Andraste's death accomplished what she could not in life, the destruction of the old god cults and the spread of the Maker's faith across Thedas. As for Maferath, we will never truly know if he was a bitter, jealous, power-hungry man, or something else. There is a heretical strain of thought that Maferath was performing the Maker's will when he betrayed Andraste, for only through her martyrdom could she truly succeed, and thus it was his actions that secured her legacy, which might have been lost if the Alamari host had been smashed against the walls of Minrathous. The possibly apocryphal Canticle of Maferath describes Andraste appearing before him after her death and forgiving him. What we can say is that the words and actions of Andraste and Maferath set the foundation for Thedas as it is today. Well, that's the end of my chronicle of Andraste's life. I think this might be one of the most important bits of lore if you want to understand the humans of Dragon Age. Andraste is basically the foundation of the entire civilization and the biggest unifying factor between the human kingdoms. There is one more part to this series, as I'll be discussing Andraste and Maferath's children and legacy a little bit. As always, leave a comment if there's a topic you'd like to see me cover.